I stood in the middle of my mother's engagement party, in a house that used to feel like home, holding a single brown envelope that was about to end everything Helen and Mark thought they had won. The room went quiet. Glasses hung in the air, halfway to toasts nobody would finish. "Read it," I said, and my voice did not shake, though my hands did. Helen's smile cracked first, the way ice cracks before it breaks apart completely. Mark looked from her to me, and I watched something in his face die. Not love, that had died months earlier, but hope, the greedy kind he had married her for. Inside that envelope was proof that the woman standing beside him in white lace, the woman who had called herself my mother for 28 years, had no more legal claim to my grandmother's fortune than the caterers pouring champagne behind her. Everything he had thrown me away for was never hers to give him. Watching my husband's dream collapse in front of 200 witnesses, I finally understood that some inheritances are not written in wills. They are written in the truths people bury, hoping no one will ever dig deep enough to find them. But before I tell you how that envelope came to be in my hands, and what my grandmother had hidden for almost 3 decades to protect me, let me take you back to where this story truly began, to a marriage I believed was unbreakable, and a betrayal I never saw coming. If stories about family, loyalty, and long-buried secrets are the kind that keep you watching until the very end, go ahead and subscribe, because this one still has a few turns left in it. Now, let's go back to the beginning. My name is Sarah, and 3 years ago I would have told you my life in Lagos was close to perfect. Mark and I lived on the 18th floor of a glass tower in Ikoyi, the kind of apartment where the lagoon looked like a sheet of hammered silver every evening at sunset. We had met at a business conference when I was 26, both of us hungry and ambitious, and within 2 years he had become the person I told everything to before I told anyone else. My mother, Helen, adored him from the first dinner. She used to say Mark had the calm of a man who knows exactly where he's going, and I believed her because I wanted to. Helen had raised me alone since my father died when I was small, and after my grandmother, a formidable woman named Grace, passed away and left the family estate in Helen's hands, my mother finally had the kind of comfort she had always insisted we deserved. I never once questioned how naturally she wore that comfort, like it had always belonged to her. Mark worked in property development, chasing bigger contracts every year, and somewhere along the way he began spending more evenings at my mother's house than at our own, telling me it was business, telling me Helen had investment properties she wanted him to help manage. I believed that too. Looking back now, I can see the small cracks I chose not to look at directly, the way he would lower his voice when he answered her calls, the way he started dressing differently, more carefully, on the days he said he was meeting her. I was building my own career in marketing, working long hours, and I told myself that a husband who got along with my mother was a blessing, not a warning. I did not yet know how expensive that kind of blindness would turn out to be. It was a Tuesday evening in March when Mark came home early, which was unusual enough that I noticed before he even said a word. He sat across from me at our dining table, the one we had bought together in our first year of marriage, and he did not touch the food I had made. "Sarah," he said, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to let me finish before you say anything." I remember thinking, in that strange suspended second before disaster, that I should have been afraid, and instead I only felt a kind of dull curiosity, the way you feel right before you step on a stair that isn't there. He told me he had fallen in love with someone else. He told me it had been building for over a year, and when I asked, foolishly, hopefully, who, he could not look at me when he answered. "Helen," he said. My own mother's name in my husband's mouth sounded like a language I had never learned. I laughed at first, an ugly, disbelieving sound, because surely this was some cruel joke. Surely my husband was not sitting in our home, telling me he wanted to leave me for the woman who had carried me, who had raised me, who had sat across from him at every holiday dinner for 5 years. But Mark's face did not change, and that was when I understood he meant every word. He told me that he and Helen were planning to marry, that they wanted to combine their lives, and, though he tried to dress it in softer language, their fortunes. He said Helen controlled the family estate now, the properties, the investments, everything my grandmother had built over a lifetime, and that with him beside her, they could grow it into something even larger. I sat there listening to my husband describe my mother's wealth like a business opportunity, and somewhere underneath the horror, a small, cold voice in me noted that he had never once mentioned loving her for who she was. I confronted Helen the next morning at her house on Bordelon Road, the same house I had grown up visiting on weekends after Grace passed it to her. She did not deny it. She stood in her kitchen in a silk robe, stirring tea as though we were discussing the weather, and told me that love does not follow rules, that she and Mark had simply found something real, and that she hoped, in time, I would understand. I remember staring at her, this woman I had called Mummy my entire life, searching her face for some flicker of shame, and finding only a kind of serene, unbothered certainty that frightened me more than any apology could have. "You'll land on your feet, Sarah," she told me, as if she were offering comfort, instead of delivering the final blow. "You always do." I left her house that day and did not look back at the gate, because I already knew, somewhere in my bones, that the mother I thought I had was someone I had never actually known at all. The divorce moved quickly, faster than I had the strength to fight, because Mark wanted it finished before the wedding, and I discovered I did not have the will to drag out a marriage to a man who had already left in every way that mattered. I moved out of the glass tower in Ikoyi and into a small one-bedroom flat in Yaba, the kind of place with a single window unit that struggled against the Lagos heat, and neighbors whose lives I could hear through the walls. My best friend, Claire, helped me carry boxes up 3 flights of stairs, and somewhere between the second and third trip, I sat down on a bare mattress and cried in a way I had not allowed myself to cry in front of Mark or Helen. "They took everything," I told Claire, "and they didn't even have to fight me for it." She held me and said nothing, because there was nothing useful to say to a woman who had just watched her husband and her mother build a future out of the wreckage of hers. The months that followed were the hardest of my life, quiet in a way that felt like punishment. I threw myself into work, took on more clients than I should have, and avoided anywhere Mark and Helen might be seen together, which in a city as layered as Lagos was easier than I expected. I stopped answering Helen's occasional texts, the ones that said things like, "I still love you, Sarah," as though love were a small enough thing to survive what she had done. At night in that narrow apartment, I would sometimes let myself wonder what I had done wrong, whether there had been some flaw in me that made it so easy for the 2 people who were supposed to love me most to choose each other instead. It would be many more months before I learned the truth, that none of it had ever really been about me at all, and that the answer to my quiet, aching question had been locked in a trunk for almost 30 years, waiting for someone to finally open it. That trunk belonged to my grandmother, Grace, who had passed away 4 years earlier, and left behind a rambling old family house in Ikeja that nobody had gotten around to fully clearing out. It fell to me, as the last surviving grandchild with any interest in family history, to sort through what remained before distant relatives could argue over selling the property. One humid Saturday afternoon, months after my divorce was finalized, I climbed the narrow stairs to the attic, a space I had barely visited as a child, because Grace always said it was full of things too old to matter and too precious to throw away. Dust hung in the slats of light coming through the small round window, and tucked beneath a stack of yellowing curtains, I found a wooden trunk with a rusted lock that gave way easily under an old key I found taped beneath it, almost as though Grace had wanted it to be found eventually. Inside were letters tied with ribbon, old photographs with curling edges, and a slim folder of legal documents that at first glance looked like nothing more than old property papers. I sat down right there on the dusty floorboards and began to read, and within a few pages, my hands had gone cold, despite the heat pressing through the roof above me. The documents were guardianship papers, dated the year I was born, transferring custody of me to a woman named Helen Adeyemi, my mother's cousin, not my mother at all. Beneath them was a birth certificate, with a different name listed as my birth mother, a woman called Adeyezi, my grandmother's actual daughter, who had died in a car accident less than a month after I was born. There were letters in Grace's careful handwriting, some addressed to lawyers, some never sent, describing how Helen, grieving and ambitious in equal measure, had convinced a devastated Grace, still in shock from losing her only child, to let her step in and raise me as her own to keep the family together. and how, over the following years, Helen had quietly maneuvered herself into legal control of assets that were never truly hers to inherit, using forged consent letters and a compliant lawyer who has since passed away. While the real terms of Grace's estate, protected by a clause Grace herself had insisted on adding after growing suspicious in her final years, sat waiting, untouched, for the day her actual biological granddaughter would come looking. I read those letters twice, then a third time, my reflection blurred in the small attic window as evening settled over Acacia. 28 years of calling a woman mummy, who had built her entire life on my dead mother's absence and my grandmother's grief. I thought of every Christmas, every school event, every time Helen had smoothed my hair back and called me her daughter, and I felt something inside me that was not quite grief and not quite rage, but a strange, clarifying calm. The kind that comes right before a person decides exactly what they are going to do next. I did not confront Helen that week, or even that month. Instead, I called an old university friend, James, who had since become one of Lagos's more meticulous estate lawyers, and I laid the documents out on his office table, without a word of explanation beyond, "I need to know if these are real." James spent nearly 3 weeks quietly verifying everything, cross-referencing the guardianship papers with court archives, tracking down the notary whose signature appeared on Grace's original will clause, and confirming what the letters already told me, that under the true terms of my grandmother's estate, control was meant to pass directly to Grace's biological grandchild upon proof of lineage, a clause Helen had either never known existed or had successfully buried along with everything else. "She has been living on borrowed time, legally speaking," James told me, sliding a folder across his desk. "The moment you can prove who you are, and who you aren't, related to, this entire estate reverts to you. Everything. The house on Bourdion Road, the investment properties, all of it." I sat with that knowledge for a long moment, thinking not of the money, but of Mark, chasing a fortune that had never belonged to the woman he left me for, congratulating himself on a clever upgrade that was in truth built on nothing at all. I could have gone to Helen quietly. I could have handled it in a lawyer's office, papers exchanged without an audience. And some version of me, the version that still ached from months of quiet grief, wanted exactly that kind of clean, private ending. But then the invitation arrived. Thick cream cardstock announcing the engagement of Helen Adiemi and Mark Okafor. A garden party at the Bourdion house, the same house Grace had built, the same house Helen had stolen a life to keep. Something in me decided, reading that invitation, that the truth deserved the same audience the lie had been performed in front of for years. I called James. I asked him to prepare everything, sealed, verified, undeniable. And I asked Claire to come with me, not for protection, but as a witness to the ending of something that had taken far too long to finish. The evening of the party, the Bourdion garden was strung with fairy lights, and Helen moved through her guests in white lace, radiant in a way that used to make me proud to call her my mother. Mark stood near the fountain, laughing at something one of his old colleagues said, entirely unaware that the woman he had bet his future on was about to lose everything she had built her identity around. I walked in wearing deep green, the color Grace used to say suited me best, and I felt, for the first time in over a year, entirely steady on my feet. Claire squeezed my hand once at the gate and let go, understanding without needing to be told that this was mine to finish alone. I waited until the toasts were about to begin, until someone had tapped a glass and the crowd had gathered near the fountain, before I walked to the center of that garden, with the envelope James had prepared held against my chest like something sacred. The room went quiet. Glasses hung in the air, halfway to toasts nobody would finish. Helen saw me first, and her smile faltered just slightly, the way it always had whenever she sensed a conversation slipping somewhere she hadn't planned for. "Sarah," she said carefully, "this isn't the time." "It's exactly the time," I told her, and I opened the envelope. I read aloud the guardianship transfer, dated the year of my birth. I read my real mother's name, Adeyeze, a woman Helen had let me forget existed. I read the clause from Grace's will, verified by James's 3 weeks of careful work, stating plainly that the estate reverted to Grace's biological grandchild. The moment her true identity could be proven. Proof I now held in a folder for every guest in that garden to see if they wished. "Read it," I said, holding the papers out toward her, though by then I no longer needed her to. Everyone else already had. Helen's composure did not shatter all at once. It cracked the way ice cracks, before it breaks apart completely. First, a hairline fracture in her expression, then a slow, visible collapse as she realized how many people were watching her realize it too. Mark looked from her to me, and I watched something in his face die. Not love that had died the day he chose her over me, but hope. The particular greedy hope of a man who had wagered his future on a fortune that had just evaporated in front of 200 witnesses. "Sarah," he said quietly, stepping toward me. "If this is true, then Helen doesn't—" He stopped himself, but I finished the sentence in my head anyway. "Helen doesn't have anything." Which meant, in the calculus Mark had always run beneath his charm, that I might be worth returning to, after all. He reached for my hand, and for one strange moment I let him hold it, not out of longing, but out of something closer to disbelief that he could still, even now, imagine there was a version of us to salvage. "I made a mistake," he said, low enough that only I could hear it, over the murmur spreading through the garden. "We can fix this, Sarah, you and me." I looked at him for a long moment. This man who had once known every detail of my life, and had traded all of it for an estate that was never real. And I felt, for the first time since that Tuesday evening at our old dining table, something almost like peace. "You didn't leave me for my mother, Mark," I said, pulling my hand free. "You left me for money that was never hers to promise you. There's nothing here for either of you to fix." I turned and walked back through the garden gate, with Claire beside me, and behind us, I heard Helen's raised voice, finally cracking into something raw and unguarded. No longer the composed woman who had once told me, so calmly, that I would land on my feet. The weeks that followed moved quickly once the truth was out in the open. James finalized the transfer of the estate, the Bordillon house, the investment properties Grace had spent a lifetime building, all of it reverting to me under the clause my grandmother had quietly protected for nearly 30 years, as though she had always suspected the truth would need somewhere safe to land one day. Helen, stripped of the wealth she had built her second life around, moved out of the house within the month, and I heard, through mutual acquaintances rather than from her directly, that Mark had not stayed to help her pack. Whatever he had felt for her, it seems, had never been strong enough to survive the discovery that she had nothing left to offer him. I did not reach out to either of them again, and neither of them in the end reached out to me. I think often now about the moral hiding inside everything that happened to me, and it is simply this: the people who claim you cannot always be trusted to keep you, but the truth, bury or not, always eventually finds its way home. Helen spent almost 30 years wearing a life that was never hers, and Mark spent a year chasing a fortune built on that same borrowed foundation, and in the end, both of them were left with nothing but the betrayal they had built together. I, on the other hand, walked out of that garden with my grandmother's true legacy finally in my own hands. Not just the house and the properties, but the certainty of exactly who I was and who had actually loved me enough to protect me, even from beyond the grave. I still live in the Bordillon house now, though I have changed enough of it to make it feel like mine rather than a monument to what Helen took. I planted new flowers along the garden wall where the engagement party once stood, and some evenings I sit out there with Claire and think about my grandmother, Grace, who never got the chance to tell me the truth herself, but who made sure, in her own quiet, determined way, that I would find it when I needed it most. If you have made it this far with me, thank you for staying, for letting Sarah's story sit with you the way it has sat with me. If it moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear that the truth always finds its way home, and I will see you in the next story.